urban planners. No single actor possesses the singular intellectual and cultural capital to enact change. And because the culture has turned towards a more visual, spatial, data-driven mentality, architecture now finds itself in a unique position. At the nexus of theory, practice, the physical, and the virtual worlds, architecture has a unique capacity, operating as a discipline and as a profession, to step into this void. But the overall lack of diversity amongst architects and design professionals and academics has really been devastating to the discipline and the profession and the academic life in our schools of architecture that are producing architects and academics, intentionally or unintentionally. A silencing effect on the most marginalized populations, rendering them almost silent within the powerful discipline of architecture. For over half a century, the homogeneity of our educators and practitioners has led to a series of blind spots in how we have positioned our complex labor roles and rights in the profession, how the built environment operates and links into the capital markets and the economics of real estate and housing, and how architects and designers have not taken the lead in redressing some of the most harmful public policies and private conduct around environmental discrimination, housing segregation, and discrimination, and access to public goods such as parks and libraries, schools and recreation centers. Architecture, for me, has and will always begin here with the academy, the university. These are the institutions that we rely on, that the world relies on, to rigorously defend academic freedom, free speech, and in the case of the American university, to be a bulwark against the darkest forces that would move us away from empowerment and inclusion towards a backward project of exclusion, exclusivity, and marginalization of the other. The academy, and by extension, the American university, has itself become an ever more vexed environment as it faces the forces of corporatization, neoliberalism, and bureaucratization. We deal with it every single day, the three people on this panel, and many of you. And it's once again, our universities are once again a battlefield upon which the current cycle of the culture wars is being fought. How many university presidents have you seen recently defending the teaching of critical race theory in our colleges and universities? How many university presidents, or deans for that matter, have you seen recently calling out the fraudulent claims of a stolen U.S. presidential election and the dangers of the turn towards fascism in our own country? How many university presidents or deans have you seen recently defending the use of affirmative action in university admissions? Probably, I didn't see any hands go up, probably not many. Yet university presidents such as Ezra Cornell and others, with their flaws, progressive thinkers that they were influential in the early admission to universities of Jews, blacks, and women, and saw the university, the role of the university, as a unique and innately democratic project, and their roles as protectors of this critical asset necessary for a functioning democracy. The subaltern voice must be present, and I believe we can play a role in making it so. I want to turn to my last section that will hopefully foster additional discussion in the Q&A and moderated conversation. Modernity and modernism in architecture thinking, something dear to my heart and to the heart and soul of this great school of architecture. How do we reckon with the ideologies of modernity and architectural modernism as an enduring component of our current architecture pedagogy, our practices and habits, our methodologies of knowledge exchange, and our common language through which we regulate the canonization of new ideas? I think artist Mark Bradford efficiently summarizes the feeling that some graduates of Cornell architecture Harvard, and many other schools of architecture feel. I'll read his quote, which you have, very short one this time. I want to engage a social, political conversation about the contemporary world that I live in or my relationship to it, and at the same time, I want to abstract it. I think many graduates of these universities, these architecture schools, feel that we're indebted to a set of institutions that were rigorous in their teachings of the modernist canons and the operational methodologies developed to translate that thinking to a new generation of designers and thinkers. And I'm including here the socially progressive, if misguided, aspirations of European modernism. Yet what we find now is that this education was in fact a miseducation, failing to de-universalize notions of human subjectivity, alterity, and subalterity, and that this enforcement of rigor was at one and the same time an enforcement of dogma. If there's anything that I have learned as an academic leader, it's to rid my faculty and students of the notion that rigor and dogma are one and the same. Abstraction is fundamental to the discourse of architecture. That's not the problem. The problem is the narratives and the exclusionary histories and theories that guide interpretation and ideological absorption. Architecture's estrangement from the political and ideological estrangement that affects the discipline and practice of architecture has become an impediment to the development of a collective voice to address these issues. The version of the political to which I'm referring is an Arendtian version, whereby citizens are in active engagement with the communities and relationships that organize and govern their status as fellow persons, an engagement that exceeds the limits of any formal institutional affiliation with political parties or the state. Now, in some of these examples that may be familiar to you, I'm going to set up some polemical situations that hopefully we can get into in the Q&A, but I just want to put in motion here that in this exhibition in 1967-68 at the Museum of Modern Art on urban redevelopment, 5 teams were selected from Ivy League universities with no black participation, no persons of color, trying to reimagine Harlem. And we're to understand from Colin Rowe's team here that the creation of an urban texture will be beneficial for Harlem, a kind of flipping of solid, figure ground, park, cityscape. Or Le Corbusier's reinterpretation of classical form in a new way carries the weight of that original precedent, further instantiating the European precedent as a cultural centering device from which to register cultural meaning. Or the Eisenman and Koolhaus deconstructions of the conventional program space city to advance a particular kind of radicality. But there's always a flip side to this version of modernism. The violence, the excessive othering of indigenously populated and developed spaces and aesthetics. What I call architecture thinking exceeds the demands of the market and evades instrumentalization as a commodity. It defines the way we design our pedagogy. It defines the way we think about problems and challenges. How can we disrupt this conundrum, intervene in the hegemonic project of heroic authorship and heroic form, and I would say introduce new voices and start engaging outside of the discipline. In these images, artists Carrie James Marshall and Virgil Abloh reconsider both urban inner-city space and the interiority of space that can engender a sense of reciprocity in the positioning of bodies. In these images by artist Lauren Halsey, trained for 2 years as an architect, artist Amanda Williams, trained here at Cornell as an architect, and Emmanuel Admasu, architect at Columbia. There's the introduction of speculative imagery cityscapes that define and rezone the modernist mannerist spaces of the conventional city, dystopic, critical, yet plausibly inhabitable, these and other works by artists and architects of color slowly displacing the European modernist canon. In conclusion, I would argue that the future of architecture depends on our collective capacity to interject egalitarianism, democratization of culture, and subaltern studies into our thinking and pedagogies, and undertake the difficult project of rethinking modernity and modernism. The university here, the academy, architecture schools must be an ally of those who seek to imagine new forms of justice, new forms of egalitarian conditions. And architecture, in the end, is about power. And architecture is political. This will put us in the crosshairs of the contemporary neoliberal American university. So we need to be courageous. The principles and values that motivate us as practitioners, designers, and scholars and deans must be in alignment with how we organize our schools, invest in our collective future, and innovate with purpose and intentionality. And in closing, I would say there's things that we can and are doing, expanding everything about architectural pedagogy to be multidisciplinary. We know that over 50% of our students are not going into traditional practices. So what are we educating them to do? Expanding knowledge exchange methodologies to center knowledge collaboration outside of the university so that the university becomes more porous. Being intentional about contemporary problem studios that are focused on the present versus those that are focused on the future. And being intentional about how we can override some of the conventional, outdated forms of knowledge production emerging from our own discipline, as well as urban planning, real estate development, finance, that really are inhibiting our ability to radically transform the discipline. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dean Curry. That was indeed exciting in so many different ways. Now we're going to pass it on to Dean Whiten. Sarah Whiten is Dean, and Joseph Yu Sert, Professor of Architecture at the GSD at Harvard University. She's also a design principal and co-founder of WW Architecture, having served as the Dean of Rice University's School of Architecture between 2010 and 2019. She has taught at Preston University, the University of Kentucky, the Illinois Institute of Technology, and the University of Florida. Before founding WW Architecture, she worked with the Office of Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam, Peter Eisenman, and Michael Graves. She also received her PhD in architectural history from MIT with a dissertation on space form and democracy. So we could indeed talk about democracy for hours, but we're going to talk about that and other things. And I point out all of these different spaces that she's inhabited because she knows every corner and every space and every disciplinary version that there is to know about architecture. And perhaps because of this, her research is broadly interdisciplinary. She's an expert in architectural theory and urbanism, with particular interest in architecture's relationship with politics, economics, and society, and on ways in which the built environment shapes the nature of public life. So I think the transition works really well. Her work has been published in little journals and collections, and I'm not going to name them all. But again, speaking to the multiple institutional experiments that she's, not experiments, but experimentations that she's done throughout her career. She's also the founding editor of Point, a book series aimed at shaping contemporary discussions in architecture and urbanism. You know, her work on historiography has been particularly calling on historians, but also architects to think very carefully about what it means to be critical, what it means to be political, by proposing new intellectual and institutional ways to engage with society and politics, to think about the future, but also about the present. So please help me welcome Dean Whiten to the stage.
Super. You're not letting them see all of my images, are you? No. Okay. Hi. Thank you, and I want to thank Carolyn for inviting me and Gwendolyn for all her work behind the scenes. It's great to be here. Really, this is an excuse for me to meet Lunasa, so I'm hoping that that happens at some point. So I want to thank Milton for that sobering but really important opening to tonight's session. I think this has been a really interesting conference, and I hope to contribute to it as well. So happy birthday, Cornell Architecture. I'm a bit of a fish out of water here. I didn't go to Cornell. I didn't teach at Cornell. I've only been here once before. That was actually, I will say, I'll give a shout out to Brandon Hookway, who was an amazing host for me when I was here last time. Very generous with his time and his intelligence. So I was intrigued by our setup here to sort of look backward in order to move forward. And here are two Barbara Kruger images that I think really are critical for setting up this conversation. The future belongs to those who can see it, which is an acknowledgement that we traffic in the future. We as deans or as academics, and frankly, we as architects. So we teach students, but we're also, as architects, all practicing and trafficking and creating futures. Second, your fictions become history. So we may traffic in the future, but we're always doing so through fictions, that is, through representations of that future. These visions, these fictions become history as they get transformed. And additionally, this is an acknowledgement of how we look at efforts in our disciplines and our professions. They're an accumulation of fictions that form our history, and that's why that history is always relevant. I find fiction is not a derogatory term. I feed from fiction all the time. Okay, so we look backwards to look forward, and our forward-looking becomes our history, but what about the present or the now? It doesn't look so bright, honestly. Our world is in trouble politically, environmentally, economically, socially. We all know that. I think for those of you who will be practicing until 2070, it's a pretty tough horizon out there. Additionally, our context is remarkably accelerated. And I don't think this is just a question of, as you get older, time seems to go by faster, although people tell that to me. And I think it is true. But I actually think our world as we know it is highly accelerated. So it's old news by now that we live in a 24/7 world, but it's important to recognize that that's done something to us. So keep these 2 points in mind. Our global context is at an all-time low, and we live in an accelerated world. So Hans Hohlheim told us already in 1968 that architecture is everything. I refer to this all the time because I think that it is a sort of remarkable piece, that he includes traditional architecture or architectural thinking, Liszewski, a traditional window, but also I love the spread that includes the from an aerosol can, and the idea that just the changing of the air through these molecules of an aerosol can is itself architecture because it's changing the environment. And so it's a remarkable piece, remarkable argument. You can see the washer creating a monument in a square. Everything is architecture. So this is not a new idea. So architecture is everything, and this is something that I think this is what makes architecture schools so remarkably exciting and so incredibly hard for us trying to figure out, okay, how do you corral all that everything? How do you translate that for students into something that they can do something with? How do we sit at that intersection with everything? So what's our role? Our role as architects, and then our role as teachers of architecture and as deans of design schools, that is, as herders of cats. I always have to get cats in here. So I find it sort of astonishing that when you Google for an image of herding cats, this result is among the top hits. And it might be a little hard to read because it was a small image, but it was so good I wanted to keep it up. And it says, "At least I'm not managing change in education." What the hell? So this I found very funny, but also really, really alarming. Okay, so back to serious stuff. So we create structures. That's one of the things that we do as architects. We create structures. This is Marina City going up in 1958. And it's, I think it's still remarkable to look at what it is when a building goes up. So we create structures, and we create systems. So this is, the platting of one of those many suburbs somewhere in the flat west. So these structures and systems produce walls, they produce infrastructures, they permit and prevent access. Strangely, it seems that it's become harder and harder to discuss this aspect of our work of creating structures, of creating walls, of creating limits. And partly that challenge of discussing this part of what we do is maybe comes from a critique of form. So because when you talk about structures, you're talking about things like walls, forms that create insides and outsides. And so that's become a difficult thing to do. But it's also, in part, the challenge of talking about structure and system maybe also comes from two legacies. One legacy is that of universal space from Mies. So this idea of, which, I love Mies, everyone knows that. I love Crown Hall. But this aspiration to an architecture of universal space is an architecture that is totally flexible and almost nothing, right? So that's one challenge to the discussion of structure and system. The other challenge is that comes from Rudofsky, from his exhibition, Architecture Without Architects, from 1964 at MoMA. Seems like we're all going to be discussing MoMA examples. In the 60s. But so this idea of ushering in attention to vernacular societies and structures, and that's been quite valuable, but why has this expansion of the discipline come at the expense of considerations of form? So this combination of universal space and attention to the vernacular has been one consequence has been a growing anxiety about designing fixed forms, and anxiety regarding how we are, in fact, responsible for creating limits. So one plea for the future of architecture is for the importance of specificity and the acknowledgement of specificity in what we do. We create walls, we create spaces, we use materials. And that means thinking through that specificity. It means not turning to arches or gable roofs or flat pastel walls. Simply, that's because that's what every other project online is doing. But instead, it means working out the specificities of each decision that we make, carrying them through an entire project to see how a radius or how a particular material affects form, program, relations, and possibilities, how it affects futures. And I will have to acknowledge here that the other W in WW has a lot more patience for that specificity and that materiality. And so Ron deserves a real shout out for the patience that's needed for carrying architecture from idea to execution, which I think is something that we don't talk about enough in school. So along these lines, I want to make a suggestion that we need to advocate for innovation as opposed to imitation, so as a form of teaching architecture. So this is one of my favorite pairings, but it sort of falls on deaf ears as my audience gets younger and younger. But I do think there's a recent resurgence in Julia Child, and if you don't know who Julia Child is, don't admit it to me publicly, but look her up on YouTube, because she really is an extraordinary figure. So Julia Child reconceived French cooking for an American audience. She took a canon, French cooking, and translated it, tweaked it for an American audience with verve, aplomb, and exuberance. Julie Powell, who's the subject of the movie Julie and Julia, was a 20-something blogger who decided to take as a project, taking every recipe in Julia Child and Simone Beck's cookbook, the Art of French Cooking, and make every recipe in it one by one. And so it was an exercise in perfect execution, but imitation of the innovation that Julia Child had put forth. And so I use this example a lot when I'm teaching, especially when I'm teaching thesis, in that I think that that's really where we're trying to encourage students to situate themselves as Julia Childs as opposed to Julie Powell. So the perfect technique or imitation isn't nearly as powerful as the innovation and the translation of something. So in short, we need to enable students to be able to see their futures, recognize architecture's fictions, and construct their own that direct them and us forward. And that means keeping architecture at the core, let's say, of what they're doing, while recognizing how it impacts and affects all of that alles: politics, economics, technology, and more. So the A is for architecture, T is technology, P politics, E economics, that we need to sort of always make sure that we understand that we keep architecture at the middle of the table, let's say. So if the first point I want to leave you with is specificity, and more specifically design specificity, the second is communication. So for an architectural education, a design education is extraordinarily valuable in that, unlike any other discipline, it teaches you to think and communicate both visually and verbally. While you're working and as you're producing, you're using both of those modes at the same time. And no other discipline does that. At least that's what I argue. And so then we come back to this challenge of our time with the 24/7 news cycle. So communication has completely changed with this transformation. And I realize this transformation happened before most of you were born, but for some of us, it really transformed our relationship to the world. So with the 24/7 news cycle, when I was a kid, the television turned off at a certain hour and just turned to static, right? And so you didn't have access to information all the time. So with this 24/7 news cycle, communication has completely changed. And I'm going to turn away from architecture to make my point. Just turn to communication more broadly. And let's look at the New York Times and how it's transformed over the years. So the New York Times was one of the last papers to introduce color. It did so on October 16th, 1997, which may not seem like a big deal, but it turned the newspaper from a document to a picture of reality, or at least a closer one. So this transformation, this inclusion of color, brought the immediacy of the news more directly to the newspaper. NewYorkTimes.com started around the same moment, actually, so pretty early on, but it didn't really take off until 2012 with this multimedia feature about the Tunnel Creek avalanche. And this feature on their website used aerial video, animated simulation, and interactive graphics. So now we've come to expect these complex graphic stories from their digital site. So for example, there was a recent story on the shadows in New York, which allowed you to look at different neighborhoods at different seasons and at different times of day. This is sort of, I really think this is amazing that the newspaper has taken on this ability to convey this information visually and verbally. Or look at their feature about Uber drivers, and looking at how idle Uber drivers actually lost money. For those of us who had Super Mario as small children, this is quite telling. And they've expanded into different media, most particularly podcasts, where certain hosts have become real rock stars. So there was even an article they produced on Marco Barbaro's hums. And as an aside, I find it personally quite disconcerting that we now know what writers look like, that they have their images. But the podcast, so they've expanded their empire. You can watch this transformation of a medium and see how they've saved themselves, but how they've also expanded their reach through visual communication. Finally, they've also even changed the traditional print medium when they printed the names of all the COVID deaths on the front page of the paper. So architecture also has the power of communication with the broader public. So to quote de Tocqueville, democracy itself, he called, a box with a false bottom. You can put in and take out whatever meaning you want. It's one of the most extraordinary quotes in Democracy in America. So let's use, as a quick example, city halls. So here's New York City's City Hall, a French Renaissance pile, done by Jean-François Mangin and John McComb, finished in 1812, so just a year after the 1811 Commissioner's Plan of Manhattan. It's the longest-serving city hall to serve its original function as a city hall, a working city hall. It epitomizes City Hall. But if you look, and this actually, Maria mentioned my dissertation, this is part research from that. So if you look at a city hall from 1941, this is Franklin and Kump's Fresno City Hall, built in 1941, you see a very different interpretation of what a city hall might be. So this one note was completed during World War II. And imagine what image the architects and clients wanted to convey to the public about what a city hall could be. So it's a complete change from what a city hall would have been, right? So if you think of the Manhattan City Hall, that's a very typical idea of a city hall. Here you have a building with a brick veneer, still centralized. You can see that in the bottom image. It's been turned into the City Hall Annex, which I find really painful. But it has this amazing glass front at the front. And then one of the most extraordinary things is there are no stairs. They're just ramps. It's a kind of dumb equation of easy access and democracy. So it's you see this as a transition from a traditional notion of what a city hall should be to a modern city hall. It's a little building out in Fresno, California. It was included in Elizabeth Mock's Built in USA exhibition at MoMA, again, MoMA, which was an example of American buildings from 1932 to 1944. And again, this was built in 1941. So here you have an idea of how architecture communicates to a public, communicates the idea of a changed notion of democracy that's happening during World War II, and a shift of saying that there could be a modern, more fluid, more transparent, more accessible form of civic government. Another example might be considering post offices. I have a very soft spot for post offices. And again, these were post offices in city halls, courthouses were often the same, one and the same, but these are a series of post offices which occupy a central or important place within American cities. Ralph Nader wrote a terrific piece last November on ways to save our historical postal service. I'd also point to a recently published book entitled The U.S. Postal Service, Democracy and the Corporate Threat. And again, you see a transformation of a type of building that, again, here you see many different versions, but they all speak to some form of civic idea of what a community translates to, what a public translates to. And this is what you find mostly as post offices today. So this idea of the corporate threat is rendered quite visible as post offices become mollified. Not M-O-O-L, but M-A-L-O. So indeed, this is what the post office has become. So this is, I'm not encouraging a return to the historic structure, though I believe we should conserve and repurpose the strong building stock that we have. And again, I'd underscore that Franklin and Kump example of taking a public structure, or taking an idea of a public structure and tweaking it to make it a contemporary example of a city hall. And so I'd point to this as an example of a Julia Child, let's say, in terms of offering up a public building. I'll point to an example from our own office. This is actually one of our first projects. It was for a community center in Lexington, Kentucky, called the Intra-Center. And we actually returned to this project and redrew it because we realized it's a very important project for our office. So it's located in a part of Lexington where 90% of the population lives under the poverty line. It's a very small community within Lexington, which is otherwise a fairly wealthy city, thanks to the horse industry. And this was a building that was commissioned by the principal of an elementary school next door and a community leader who wanted to create a building that would be for community services, ranging from a police outlet to a library to a gym to all sorts of services, public services and amenities. So with this project, we essentially looked at the relationship between form and program. And so in the first image you see where the arrow shouldn't be anymore, but it is, that's where form and program are concentric. And what we were trying to do was allow for form and program to actually exist in an oscillated state, let's say. So we were interested in the idea of the parentheses. I realize this is a marked up copy, so you're going to see all sorts of red marks. That's okay. So we were interested in the idea of the parentheses as a way of holding a thought within a larger text. And what is the architectural equivalent of that? And so these, we essentially created parentheses that could hold space, but instead of being singular parentheses that are holding one idea, they are sort of a nested relationship. The structure is very simple, and it has a big plenum in the center to get air through. That's just to show that it really was thought out structurally. But this is, you can see the lower level, the ground floor, and moving up. And so these parenthetical relationships essentially create discrete relationships from, I don't know if I have, yeah, I do. Okay, so for example, the library and the classrooms, you could see a relationship that is formally suggested by the larger space here. At the same time, you have a smaller parentheses in here. And so there's essentially this oscillating relationship across these programs to suggest different relationships in the program. I'm not going to go into it in great detail. That gives you some idea of how these programmatic relationships can oscillate across. And I use this project as an example in part because some people said to us, oh, you're designing for this poor part of Lexington. You should design something that's very traditional. They're going to want like a brick traditional centered building. And we presented this building several times to the community, and they didn't have any problem understanding what we were talking about in terms of offering up possibilities of how different programs could relate to other programs. And so it really was, I think, an example of how one can understand that the public can understand architecture partly if you can communicate it correctly, but also if you're offering what possibilities it generates. The most recent issue of the Harvard Design Magazine that just came out, issue number 49, is on the publics. It's edited by landscape chair Anita Beresbieta and urban planning professor Diane Davis, who state in their editor's letter that the issue was, quote, born out of deep concerns for the status of our shared commonwealth in the wake of multiple political controversies and social crises of the past 2 decades. With this issue, they continue, we want readers to think about the territoriality, the physicality, and the materiality of the public, and to grasp and comprehend where it is and where it is not in today's deeply divided world. And you can see from the table of contents that there's a specificity to what they're defining as the public. It's not exhaustive at all. It's obviously an enormous topic, but there's a specificity to what they're looking at, where design intersects issues in the world. And these are the conversations that we need to be bringing into our schools and out into the world. Or you can see from the index the number of topics, the key terms that come out of this issue. And I'm going to point to just one piece in here by political theorist Bonnie Honig, her piece is called Find a Streetlight, Step Out into the Shade, or Step Out of the Shade. And it starts off by connecting the public to its spaces and things. She's sort of admittedly springboarding from Hannah Arendt, who I find has been essentially referenced in almost every talk in this whole symposium. So Honig writes, she opens her piece by saying, some rare people are strong enough to survive assaults on common sense by relying on their moral compass or sense of justice. But most people, especially in dark times, need reality checks from trusted others with different perspectives on a shared world. Political and institutional spaces, the publics they convene, art, architecture, trusted media, streetlights, and public signage all play a vital role in holding our shared world together and orienting us in it. So I love that Bonnie Honig, who's one of my favorite political theorists, recognizes that the small street furniture of urbanism actually plays a significant role. She ends her piece with one of the quotes that I've pulled out in this image. She says, can't find a streetlight? Be one, put one up, or work to elect a new mayor who will lead on such things. If we care for the world with such ordinary and sometimes extraordinary acts of maintenance, the world will repay the kindness by offering the illumination, orientation, and shelter we need to advance democratic equality for all. This beautiful ending for me recalls the words of Tim Ingold's moving keynote that opened this 150th birthday party symposium, his call to lead life in the company of others. And here I leave you with the winning entry of the Los Angeles New Streetlight Design Competition, which Christopher Hawthorne, Los Angeles' chief design officer and former architecture critic of the LA Times, launched in 2020. So the competition was won by Project Room, the office Project Room, with their design Super Bloom. And I think it's a terrific example of extreme flexibility through specificity. So the project lead, Sandy Yum, explained that the intention of the design was to take the ever-increasing number of things we demand from our streetlights, shade, traffic sensors, telecom, EV charging, wayfinding, banners, the list goes on, she said, and to translate that into a single form that's uniquely LA. Now, you can quibble about the precise form of these streetlights, but I think that there's something quite remarkable about their ability to take on all of those tasks and yet remain legible as a system that would cut across LA. Slowly, the idea is that streetlights will be replaced with these across LA. Milton can keep us posted on that. So to summarize, since we live in an age of acceleration and shortened attention spans, so here I'll summarize. Construct your futures, knowing that they'll accumulate as many histories. Pay attention to the other histories that have accumulated in our collective past. Don't shy away from specificity. Innovate, don't imitate. And communicate visually and verbally with a broad public. Live life and work in the company of others so as to advance democratic equality for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Milton, for your provocative, polemical, and equally sobering and inspiring presentations. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce our Dean, J. Mi-Jin Yoon. Dean Yoon is a person of many firsts. She was appointed as the first female head of the Department of Architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she is the first woman to be named Dean of the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning here at Cornell. Mi-Jin is indeed a pioneer and a game changer, admired and widely recognized for her work that integrates responsive technologies and architecture to create interactive environments and public spaces. I first encountered Mi-Jin's work in the early 2000s when she established MY Studio to pursue creative installation projects at the intersection of art, architecture, and technology, such as her notable white noise, white light installation for the Athens 2004 Olympics. Dean Yoon is a generous collaborator, her longest and most extensive collaboration being with partner Eric Howler. In 2004, Yoon and Howler co-founded Howler plus Yoon Architecture. The practice operates locally, nationally, and internationally on a range of interdisciplinary design projects that work across the domains of architecture, urban design, public space, and immersive experience. The work of Howler plus Yoon frequently operates at the cutting edge, liminal zones that provoke, not as a rule or principle, but because their work is at the forefront of exploring how advanced and emerging technologies, including digital fabrication, will profoundly affect how we live, work, communicate, and play now and well into the future. They're committed to conceptualizing design technology in answer to its larger cultural and political ramifications in the co-generation of social environments and public spaces. In all of this remarkable work, there is embedded a commitment to design as a collaborative process across disciplinary boundaries to generate architecture in public spaces that provide openings, inspire participation, and nurture collectivity. This commitment and spirit is also resonant and resolute in Dean Yoon's academic leadership and as an educator. During her 17 years at MIT and recently as head of the Department of Architecture from 2014 to 2018, Mi-Jin was admired internationally for her support and encouragement of the design research practices of her faculty colleagues, especially young and emerging architecture faculty at MIT. She worked to establish the first design minor for any major at MIT and innovated cross-cutting courses such as Design Across Scales, co-taught with colleague Neri Oxman. In 2016, Mi-Jin was awarded the Teaching Award of Excellence by the Acadia community. She also received the New Generation Design Leadership Award by the Architectural Record in 2015, the U.S. Artist Award in Architecture and Design 2008, and the Rome Prize in Design in 2005. In 2019, Mi-Jin returned to the academic home that seeded her expansive design education and interests, having received a B.Arch from Cornell University with the AIA Henry Adams Medal in 1995. As our new dean. In the last 3 years, she has kept us busy and inspired as to take action across our departments as a collaborative community at AAP through new entities such as the Center for Cities, the Design Plus Tech Initiative, the Council for Diversity and Inclusion, and many other important initiatives. An architect, educator, and founder of the Design Across Scales Lab, Yoon is committed to advancing creative and critical practices and pedagogies and to developing new knowledge and imaginaries that address the many urgent environmental and social challenges we face in our cities and communities. Please join me in welcoming our Dean, Mi-Jin Yoon.
That was so long, Jenny. see if I can do this. Sorry, I'm having a technology problem. No. Power, great. All right, do you see anything up there? Yep. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Jenny, for that introduction. Very long. And I'm really humbled to speak after both Milton and Sarah. You know, it's always fantastic to have a big birthday like a sesquicentennial. One, I think, makes you feel young, and two, reminds oneself to always have the long view. As many of you know, I was a BARC student I started over 30 years ago. And at that time, Milton, not to date you, but he was a beloved professor. And it's really special to have both Milton and Sarah here. They have been incredible mentors and such role models in the field. So I'd like to frame my particular contribution to the conversation around the relationship between pedagogy and practice, past and present, in order to project a little bit into the future. And while it's been over a quarter century, I think, since I was a student here, some things have changed. But the one thing that I think is consistent is both then and now, the discipline felt very much at a crossroads. So the urgencies of our time and the heightened awareness of just how inextricably intertwined our discipline is with the matters of our time, and we heard many of them, make this moment particularly fraught. I love Milton's definition of the university even as a battleground. What's the matter is a way to take stock of the moment, and in doing so, it asks, what matters? What's the matter, and how do we as architects build, create, and enable what matters? If we survey the present, we find ourselves in an awkward moment where everything we had been taught about social distancing and the pandemic is shifting, and we're in person and also hybrid, remote, and digital, and we find that we have to relearn what it means to be social. Pre-pandemic, we had already experienced a saturation of technologies in the public realm, every interaction, encounter mediated. We live in a planetary and interconnected age, a moment characterized by both a superabundance of information and connectivity, and at the same time, an unprecedented amount of uncertainty. It is in fact ironic or illuminating that this age of information coincides with the age of post-truth, alternative realities, and alternative facts. Today, we feel politically more divided, more and more divided, and we have collectively witnessed the fragility of our institutions and the fragility of democracy alongside the resiliency of autocracies, violence, and hate. We see violence, destruction, and tragedy in Ukraine and all around the world, and at the same time, we're grappling with the legacies of violence, forced dispossession, enslavement, and racism in the United States. And in addition to these deep social, economic, and political questions of our time, we're in the midst of a climate catastrophe, and the planet is burning quite literally. So what can we do in the face of these daunting layered challenges? As designers and stewards of the built environment, how do we have agency? How do we take action to build a better world? When the Eameses were asked if design was an expression of art, Charles responded, no, it's an expression of purpose. And when asked if design was a method of expression, he responded, no, it's actually a method of action. And then when asked what are the boundaries of design, he responded rhetorically, what are the boundaries of problems? So purpose, action, and problems, I think, are what bind our discipline together. So how can we reimagine architecture education to prepare us for our present and our future? And if we use the lens of purpose, action, and problems, I think we can begin to understand what's resilient versus recursive versus contingent in our existing pedagogical models. So I'd like to do this by highlighting 3 institutional contexts, MIT, Cornell, and UVA, and the relationship of pedagogy and practice, and my own intersections with them as an academic and a practitioner. I'm also going to use the trope of the model, both literally and figuratively, to look at the intertwined systems that create feedback loops between pedagogy and practice. Mark Wigley, in his essay, Prosthetic Theory, The Disciplining of Architecture, talks about how the first universities were not institutions or places as we have come to now understand them, but really a collection of faculty and practices. And by practices, he was referring to pedagogical practices. And the first school of architecture in the US, just by a few years older than here, was MIT. And it literally began as a collection of books, artifacts, and the pedagogical practices we know today as the studio and the thesis. And in the curation of this collection, there was the knowledges and practices to be included, what we now would call the canon, and the knowledge and practices to be excluded, which the Academy is grappling with today. And of course, this curation of pedagogies is itself an active practice over time, which gives us hope. So the one model, or the first model I wanted to highlight is the research model, and how the research model intersects with architecture pedagogy. And I'm going to use 2 parallel histories at MIT, which might be useful. One is around materials and building technology, and then the other one is around seeing and reimagining the world. So in the wake of the Second World War, MIT moved to consolidate its position as a leader in scientific and technological education, building on both its military research and its partnership with industry and government, so already problematic. The School of Architecture and Planning contributed to this effort by championing research projects, hosting conferences, and offering numerous design and planning studios on the subject of housing. These efforts were stimulated in part by government promotion of home ownership and technological innovation in the home building industry. The Department of Architecture sought to take advantage of these trends and position itself as the thought leader on the future of housing. So more lectures, conferences, and special courses, which influence, of course, studio problems and thesis research. One MArch thesis project that emerged at this time was Bodinger's An Industrialized House of Plastic in 1953, a student project. His interest in plastics led him to contact the Monsanto Chemical Company and establish the initial relationship between the company and MIT. Faculty members then, Marvin Goody and Richard Hamilton, then took up the project to design a low-cost prefabricated house made almost entirely of plastic, which was completed in 1956 as a prototype built full-scale. It was known as the Monsanto House of the Future, and it was not exhibited at MoMA. It was exhibited at Disney World. It was there for a decade between 1957 and 67, and upwards of 20 million visitors toured the House of the Future, although it had little impact in the home building industry. So almost concurrently at that time, questions of computing and visual communication and human interaction found their way into the Department of Architecture, creating an early culture of collaboration between art, science, and technology. The artist, Georgi Kepesh, was hired by the Department of Architecture to create and teach a radically new set of drawing courses. At around that time, the first computer arrived on campus. In the 1960s, computers were still sizable, prohibitively expensive, and thus MIT was one of the few places in the world where students could directly interact with computers. And it was again a student thesis, a doctoral thesis in 1963 by Ivan Sutherland, which explored kind of drawing tools, drawing geometric shapes, and would foreshadow computer-aided design and its future impact on the discipline. And amidst all of this was young Nicholas Negroponte, who was a BArch student in the program, and he studied under Kepesh, and he expanded on this kind of pedagogical contribution between art and technology and created the Architecture Machine Group, one of the first research labs in the department. And that would later seed the creation of what would become the MIT Media Lab. So this long-standing relationship at MIT between visual arts, computing, and building technology was my own context as a young faculty member, learning how to teach and practice. And the relationship between building discourse and testing to failure frames a particular set of practices around a research model. The kind of full-scale experiment. So the first model I'm going to share is the Collier Memorial, which is both an institutional project and a research context, but it's really a one-to-one experimental model. It's a project born out of a tragedy, the Boston Marathon bombing, after the Tsarnaev brothers committed this atrocity. They were fleeing through MIT's campus, and they shot and killed a campus police officer. And for me, this was the first time I was asked to think about architecture in a really tense moment where one felt that the kind of fear and tragedy could go either towards a nationalistic kind of position or one that could find a way to heal from the tragedy and move forward. And one of the challenges of the project was in the midst of all of this emotion, working with really his colleagues and friends and the community at MIT to find an appropriate way to memorialize this loss. And one of the, things that the campus officers requested was, an American flag on the site. And MIT is a very international community, and I think an American flag, even now, today, probably has a different symbolism than the American flag did at the time of the marathon bombing. So the form became a five-pointed figure such that it could be, associated with a hand, which is part of the motto of MIT, hand in mind, or that of a star. What was really important, though, was really this kind of void that was carved out of the memorial and the literalness by which we wanted the tectonics of the memorial to represent strength through many parts coming together. And so it's a fully compressive structure in which there's no tension elements, or it was conceived of that way. So every half, each of these 5 legs are half arches supporting each other. Every block literally supports each other to make this flat arch. Now, this could not have been conceived of without a set of theses that were produced by students at MIT, from Philippe Bloch to Matt DeYoung, who both finished their doctoral theses under advisor John Oxendorf, who was a collaborator for the project, specializing in masonry construction. And, but he was only one of, I would say, 5 engineers, and this is what makes this project an experiment. The 5 engineers range from the engineer who takes on all the liability and risk and stamps the drawings, to the overall comprehensive design engineer, Nippers Helbig, out of Germany, and then the contractor's engineer, and they were all deliberating how to build this. And the first request from the contractor was, oh, just cast it out of concrete, clad it in stone. And we were like, no, it actually has to do the work of supporting each other, these 32 massive blocks of stone, to represent the idea. And so, you know, the engineers disagreed, and prior to this project, I actually thought engineers knew the answer and there was always a right answer, but the engineers disagreed, so much so that there was actually quite a lot of conflict about how to go about the project. And the disagreement came about around, could the structure truly be 100% compressive structure without any tension elements? Could, in theory, it was possible if there was essentially like 0 tolerance. And so anything more than like 2 to 3 millimeters of gap between the kind of assembly would create what you just saw, failure. So the idea was that we would put these metal rods, these stainless steel rods, dowels, in a few places which were of concern, and we would put strain gauges on every joint. And then the students participated in putting all these gauges on the memorial, and the memorial was built on a scaffold. And then the keystone was dropped, and the scaffold was lowered incrementally while we were measuring the weight distribution on these giant scales below. So this is the mason kind of turning one rotation at a time, gently, carefully removing the scaffold so that the force of these blocks would gradually move into the legs without movement. And we're measuring this, and it was the most tense 6 hours, I think, of my life. And what we learned was Professor Oxendorf was 96% correct, and until about 96% of the weight was transferred, everything was fine, and then there was a little bit of movement, and that's when we poured in the grout, and once we poured in the grout, those steel pins go into action. And so the memorial stands, and just like it was conceived because of a number of theses, many students worked on the project alongside us. And I think one thing about these kind of 1-to-1 scale prototypes, like building in the real world, is they continue to be tested after after completion. And so we were no one died in this crash, but we were very happy that there were a few steel pins in the memorial when we learned that a car crashed into one of the legs. So I think, for me, there's always the purity of the ideal, the goals of the testing, and then the compromises one has to make in practice, and thinking about how those compromises become lessons around both pedagogy and practice. So, traditionally, the model is a means to an end, but what we saw in the Collier Memorial is that it's really understood as a research model, and even after construction. So the statistician George Box famously quipped, "All models are wrong, but some models are useful." So I wanted to go to the next pedagogical model, which is here at Cornell. So in 1951, University of Texas in Austin became this focal point for convergence, where innovations in architecture pedagogy were cohering around a set of principles that recast architectural education in North America. The faculty at UT Austin included Colin Rowe, John Haydock, and Bob Slutsky, among others, and they came to be known as the Texas Rangers. Their famous 9-square grid problem became a framework for teaching design studio, aligned with an emerging formalism where the plasticity of form was decoupled from structural necessity, an exercise alive and well when I was a student here. The Texas Rangers formed a network of pedagogical influence that would extend to Cooper Union, Cornell, Syracuse. John Haydock became the dean of Cooper Union and influenced many generations of architects and future educators, as did Colin here at Cornell. Colin's introduction to 5 Architects is quite an open critique, and he said that the formal expression of the work represented in the translation of European modern architecture, the work was stripped of the political and social agendas that originally motivated modernism. And the emphasis on formalism, abstraction, procedure, and representation is perhaps best represented by the work of Peter Eisenman, one of the New York Five and a student of Colin's. So Eisenman embraced this term cardboard architecture as a mode of working that was intentionally disengaged from the material tectonic or construction basis of architecture. Eisenman also enjoyed the kind of misrecognition of this built work as a model, and here he carefully doctored an aerial photograph of House 2 to render the built work as abstract as a model. And the House series uses abstraction and representation, drawing and iteration to kind of liberate formalism from material as the closest thing to a pure idea. So I think if we fast forward to today, the context that generated the 9-square grid problem would be challenging to resurrect because there is no architecture without social, political, and material environmental consequence. 2 recent books map out contemporary thinking around climate in our discipline. Keel Moe's with a focus on embodied energy, and Daniel Barber's with a focus on comfort and operational energy and modernism. And I think as a discipline, we need to think about both as integral to every design decision. And it's paralyzing. So I feel for everyone graduating, I feel it every day, and maybe I can share some of that challenge. So Kiel-Moe argues that a building represents an object instance, a temporary configuration of materials within a much larger flow of materials and labor. He analyzes the Seagram's building. It's a material audit, which highlights the urgent need to account for the brute materiality, what it takes to produce, refine, ship, install, demolish, and later dispose of architecture, both in terms of construction ecologies and carbon footprint. So after you read this book, you feel, as an architect, pencils down, like you just can't build. There, you go through, like, every material is a problem. So, yeah, so it's very hard. So maybe I will go just to specificity then, and how those kind of scholarly works are influencing a bit of how we think about building. So I think our models have shifted from like simulacra to now a kind of simulation, or a faith in simulation, which of course, should be measured. And it's actually the simulation tools that allow us to bring in the specificity of context and climate. And we recently completed this urban public community structure, and the design brief mandated kind of transparency, full height glass walls for the whole structure. Yet, creating a fully glazed structure in this climate context in Shenzhen, just north of Hong Kong, seemed really problematic. And we looked at both the regional conditions and the hyperlocal conditions, and decided to create a kind of supersize public canopy to create an extended shaded public space. So no light poles, but shade, and to reduce the heat gain on the building and on the glass. And so precedents, or our models, such as the Menil Collection or the Hydrographic Studies Center by FISAC, served as critical references. And the simulation tools aided us in this kind of search for a geometry to the louvers that could maximize diffuse light, minimize direct light and heat gain, and use the most minimal amount of material to create these louvers. And so it's the lower right-hand louver that had these qualities. And these are made out of aluminum, very thin and extruded. And it does provide the diffuse light but shade we need to create this urban public space. And, in a way, we're trying to maximize shade with minimal material. It's a 9-square grid structure, coincidentally. And I think one of the challenges, though, of this project is, we could be, super precise about this and feel a little less guilty because we used a little bit less material, and we're providing this public community structure, which has been used for COVID testing, et cetera. But you realize, like, this is a tiny impact in this massive global development of housing. So whether we're building in mass timber or in concrete or doing precast panels or working with charred wood, I think right now it's clear that the Academy is pushing practice to reconsider architecture in terms of matter and the environmental consequences of energy, material, and labor. And I think that's good in terms of the feedback. The last institution I wanted to talk about is UVA and this idea of an incomplete institutional model. So the University of Virginia is, of course, heralded for embodying the ideals of higher education and American democracy, founded by Thomas Jefferson, signer of the Declaration of Independence, third president of the U.S., architect of the University of Virginia, and owner of over 600 enslaved men, women, and children in his lifetime. So when I present this project with Mabel, Mabel always refers to this historical marker at UVA, which tells the history of UVA with no mention of slavery. And the first recognition of this silenced history was in the form of an expression of regret issued by the UVA Board of Visitors in 2007. And a plaque was installed near the rotunda. And this plaque had the unintended consequences of sparking outrage among students at UVA. Students were outraged by the limits of this recognition. It was small, it was underfoot, and that same year, Professor Frank Dukes, also a collaborator for the project, began UCARE, the University Community Action for Racial Equity. And one of the student interns created a student advocacy group called the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers in 2009. 10 years before the memorial would be built. And then in 2012, this untold history became even more tangible to the university community when archaeologists discovered 70 unmarked graves behind the university's official cemetery. So when our design team and collaborators were asked to lead a process and design the memorial, and Eric, Eto, Mabel, Frank, Greg, and I began the work to engage, develop, and design. A decade had already gone into the development and thinking around the memorial by the UVA community, students, and faculty. So, foregrounding dialogue, we tried to hold off the design process as long as possible, and we brought members from the community, UVA community, and Charlottesville community, but it took some time to bring in the most important community, which was the descendant community, into the conversations. But they became a really important, powerful voice in the design and outcome. So I think this project I've shared multiple times, so I won't go into much of it other than to say it was really important that it's a space for bringing people together. It also, as a landform, was really important to lose one's horizon line in that campus because of the way the landform of the grounds is constructed. And then there was kind of, I think the kind of most important lesson of this project, if we're talking about schoolwork, was understanding the work of the historians. So there was a meticulous, careful accounting of the labor of the enslaved, but their identities were largely unknown. And so members of our team worked closely with a group of very committed historians who worked in the archive of work ledgers, personal letters of slave owners, and an archive of daily life, labor, and violence. Historians estimate there are approximately 4,000 enslaved who worked on UVA's campus from 1870 to 65, and yet we know only just over maybe 500 community members' names, and most of them just their first name. Only a handful do we know first and last name. So like their identity was also stripped. And we thought it was important that the memorial show and share both what is known and what is unknown, resulting in essentially this kind of genealogical cloud of the community, and it stretches across this inner surface. And every enslaved human is represented by what we call a memory mark, which is a kind of slash in the stone And the memory mark kind of digs into the stone with this gesture of an arc, and that allows it to hold the water a little bit longer after it rains. And when the flat surface dries around it, it's still holding water, making the stone appear to cry, weep, or bleed. And for us, I think the most important thing about this project was UVA hired a genealogist, Dr. Shelley Murphy, who traced the descendants of the enslaved whose names had been discovered by the historians. And pictured here, Detisa Gathers and Colleen Yates, who were local activists and leaders in the descendant community, and they became our clients in a way. And we knew the memorial, and we wanted the memorial to be incomplete. And so when there's new names that are discovered, they're hand-carved into the granite. And this is 5 additional names that were discovered: Davy Hearn, Fanny Hearn, Bonnie Castle Hearn, Lily Hearn, Ben Snowden, and their names were carved in on site. So when the memorial never had a dedication because it opened during COVID, but it had this kind of impromptu gathering, which was organized for White Coats for Black Lives in remembrance of George Floyd. And the community took a knee for approximately 9 minutes as a reminder of the violence and injustices that persist in the wake of slavery. And the memorial also, many people have commented on this, open to the public just as the Confederate monuments in Richmond began to come down, and our contractor that built the memorial also took down the Confederate monuments in Richmond. And the other thing that's kind of important to understand is that during this period where we were designing the memorial, the city of Charlottesville had already begun debating the legacy of Confederate monuments, and it was kind of at a standstill. And that's what made Charlottesville and UVA a kind of flashpoint for the white nationalist rally in 2018. And it's this kind of unresolved legacy of Thomas Jefferson and the university that was kind of precisely the kind of opening for the white nationalists to seize upon. So as our incomplete institutions evolve, we need to continue to, I think, learn from our histories and actively expand our histories. And in charting the future of architectural education, I think it's hard to do that without understanding how we got here, so understanding our past, and understanding that institutions are incomplete and we have the agency to shape them. So if I'm supposed to speculate on the future of architectural education, I would say we already have the hints of the answers with us. We, just looking around, I think, can find that future tucked away in our studios, labs, and classrooms on campus. And it really is the collection of people, of faculty and students, as I tried to outline in each of my institutional examples, and our collective pedagogical practices, the studio, the thesis, the crit, the exhibition, the archive, that not only has insights, I think, into the future, but an important role and responsibility for prototyping that future, so that we can produce actionable knowledge to advance sustainability and resiliency, to advance equity and justice through engaged scholarship and engaged practices, working with memory workers and communities, and at times unbuilding in order to rethink how we build anew and how we scale that knowledge to cities and communities, while all the time empowering imagination and connecting imagination to action. So as we enter our next 150 years, and I hope we do that with creativity and criticality and care, I wanted to leave just a few takeaways, which are not as brilliant as Milton and Sarah's. Mine are very pragmatic, which is that, our ability as a discipline to imagine and render, imagination and vision palpable is our disciplinary superpower. And I think Sarah said that, right? So our ability to imagine and render that vision palpable to others and communicate it, that's our disciplinary superpower. So we need to continue to invest in imagination, but there probably is more urgency now to tie that imagination into action. The second is expertise. So I feel like many are comfortable in the building arts. We talk about building science. We talk about building equity. But I was recently in a meeting where, as architects, we had 20 consultants at the table for a small living building challenge project, which granted had high sustainability goals, but it was clear that our discipline has seeded some critical expertise that we actually need to have in order to make key decisions and be able to make a positive environmental impact in the world. And then lastly, and this one seems to contradict the one I just shared, which is about co-creation and collaboration. Like my one feedback loop from practice, I wish could enter the academy more, is that in practice, it is collaborative and contingent 100%. There is no sole authorship anymore. And if we are to we need to dispense with the myth of the genius, and we also need to, in our pedagogical practices, find ways to value co-creation and collaboration as an integral part of our teaching and learning. So I think we're still at a crossroads. I think the simple question to ask now is, who builds for whom out of what? Very simple. And I think that's a very hard question, though, to answer, given all the challenges we face. So I leave everyone with one quote by a Japanese author, Ryunsuke Sato, who said, "Individually, we are one drop. Together, we are one ocean. It's time to make an ocean." So I hope as a school and as schools, we can, as an ocean, shape the future for the better. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Mi-Jen, for an amazing presentation. So at this point, I would like to invite our esteemed guests and deans to our table here to engage in a discussion and Q&A. No, not at all. And I had prepared what is probably too long of a transition piece here, so and in the interest of time, I'm going to keep it short. But in building upon the topics, new models, and provocations that have been put forward this evening through three brilliant talks, I'd like to reference the work of Dean Dory Tunstall, who highlights the entanglements of design, technology, power, and society, with reflections on future trajectories for design education, applied research, and impactful practice. Dory's work challenges us to decolonize design through the development of a better underlying consciousness with design and technology, and the question, quote, "What does it mean to bring and indigenous consciousness to design. Tunstall argues that the values of design, technology, and other questions and important topics have been and are still largely colonial, white, supremacist, and patriarchal. So as you pointed out, Milton, in your talk, what are our next steps? And to reference your question, what are we educating our students to do when we know that 50% of our students do not go into traditional architecture practice? And at the same time, as was pointed out in all three of the presentations, we are increasingly seeing the necessity and role of design across disciplines and disciplinary frameworks. So with that, I will pass it to our esteemed panel to open up the discussion. So what are we educating our students to do, and what are our next steps?
I mean, I think that I've always, again, I'll go back to sort of maybe reiterating something that I've said, that I think that we educate our students to think and communicate verbally and visually, and that's no small thing. And I think that we also ideally educate them to be within a discipline and constantly pulling out. And I think that's also no small thing. I admire the Italian system where they've educated billions of architects. I'm really bad with numbers, so we'll go with that, right? And they have, not many of them end up as architects, but they see it essentially as a humanist education. And as the university robs the humanities, and I think Milton engaged with this really well, but I think it's something that we all have to recognize. I actually think we're a sort of secret door to the humanities and to social concerns that remain quite strong. And so I think that's actually an incredible responsibility on our part. But it's a remarkable education that is a sort of, it's at once practical and pragmatic enough to get parents to agree to send their kids into this as an education, and yet it opens kids to new horizons that I think are incredibly powerful. So that's, yeah.
I think, each of the three of us represent very privileged environments. We all get amazing students who are incredibly qualified. They already have a high aptitude for what they're going to be facing in our curricula. But there's a lot of architecture schools out there. And I guess what I would want to say is the students that we get, I have no question that they're going to be able to design buildings if they want to after going through all of our programs. And I extend that to a large tier of architecture schools. There's a lot of architecture schools that are not as good as ours, and there's a lot of students who enter those schools that are differently qualified. And so I think when we're talking about kind of architecture as a whole, I think, I don't want to say it's easy, but I mean, for us to deliver the kind of education we're delivering to the kind of students we're getting is kind of easy. Relative to the challenges that are faced deeper into the educational spectrum, and you can go deeper into the community college environment where the lives that students have are much more complicated than the lives of a lot of our students, not all of them. And to our credit, I think we're accepting students from more different backgrounds. So I think what Sarah is describing, I think, is can be delivered more easily amongst our types of schools. And therefore, our students have the luxury of being able to select their trajectory and their path where for other students, again, deeper down the spectrum, employment is, is key to their survival. So I think there's different constellations of students, there's different kind of tracks that they could go in, and I do think that we're competing hotly against engineering schools and business schools who have taken some of the special sauce of design and design thinking and so forth. So that's the context I think we're facing.
I was going to follow up on the comment about engineering schools and business schools. And, on one hand, I think maybe some of that 50% of students that are graduating from architecture programs are going into other fields that are compensating at much higher than the profession of architecture can. And one of, I guess, the important things of toggling between, I think, pedagogy and practice sometimes is you realize what the limits are on the professional side. And so when I talked about expertise, I would love to couple or marry the humanities and the full, power of the humanities and social responsibility and a kind of erudite command of kind of history and social science with expertise. And it's not just pragmatic, it's actually the kind of technical expertise, engineering expertise, environmental systems expertise that could allow architects to actually be those visionary leaders. And I think we can do it still as generalists, but I find that, if there's only one pie and there's, first there's 20 consultants and then there's 40 consultants, you realize like the architect as a conductor over time becomes less equipped to, move things forward or propose or push, against those who say they have the expertise, right? So for me, I think that's the beautiful, amazing thing about what probably drew all of you to architecture and all of us to architecture, that it has both the kind of building science and building arts and hopefully in the future building equity.
So, yeah, I'll let you talk in a second. No, because that's, I mean, we can, all of us at this table can talk for a long time, and I think at a certain point we also want to hear people in the audience. But I wanted to jump onto what Milton brought up, because I think it's very important. We are indeed at very privileged environments, and I and you have also taught at different schools, let's say, which is, I think, very telling. But I think there are 2 points that I would make there. One is, I think part of what we do is, and this came out, I think, in all 3 talks, is teach students to be part, sort of, citizen architects or citizens in the world, and engage in the world, and for people who have not necessarily had the education they've had. And I think having a responsibility to take that privilege and do better for others is partly at play. But I think the other thing to recognize is that even in our privileged environments, we're discovering the limitations that are being put on the American education system of devaluing of education from already K through 12 and the effects it's having on us. More so than, I think, the devaluing of education across the world, and we have very international student bodies, but the issue of education broadly is where I think we also need to bring some of our attention to increasing access to education broadly and K through 12.
Mm-hmm. Leading to this question of expanding our publics, our students, but also who we talk. I was thinking when you were mentioning expertise on technology and sciences of materials, on the humanities as well, but there's another pool of experts that has been appearing here and there, which is those who do not inhabit higher education. They're experts of their own experiences, and you're calling very explicitly to understand this exchange of expertise on lived experience together with these other forms of technologically but also humanistic expertise. How do we think together, right? And bringing some historical analysis to this question of the public, which has been sort of so prevalent in all of your presentations, the public as such, as sort of that force, that expertise that we can channel for the future of our own purposes, but the public has also been used for, different political purposes that build in more democracy. The public was the element of fascistic politics, to name another ghost that has been in all of your presentations. So how do we continue the incomplete project of democracy that you've all referred to by engaging with the public without fetishizing the public, without flattening the public as something that is objectively good to, and even assuming that as architects or as humanists we can even understand, comprehend, or label as such. How do we think collaboratively with publics in a School of Architecture in ways that are responsible, because the stakes are really high? So that's kind of a large question that you may want to address. I think that the ghost of fascism is really, truly at stake at this moment, and I think that the public, it's a difficult category to think about. So that's something that I would ask.
To make the conversation interesting, I think that, our collective kind of insecurity around expertise as a discipline is a disease. I don't think when I look at private equity, when I look at people who are developing apps or starting companies, they don't have the kind of insecurities that we labor over and obsess over. And so I'm not that concerned that introducing a more radical platform of multidisciplinarity within our educational institutions and giving people the ability to slip and slide, and some will come out, just as we all have from our undergraduate professional degree programs or graduate professional degree programs, with different interests that have expressed themselves through electives and projects outside of the classroom, undergraduate or graduate research projects where you're working with somebody who really is mentoring you. So the students already come out with certain trajectories and emphases that lean on certain kinds of experiences that develops them into whatever they're going to do. So I would say let's drop some of that insecurity, because nobody else has it, and they seem to go out fearlessly and start new companies and start new businesses and new apps, et cetera. But I think the radical multidisciplinarity is needed, because clearly, we're talking about the issues we're talking about, and we haven't somehow embedded into our curriculum the necessary things that help people, that help kind of everybody on kind of a median level come out with a certain consciousness. Again, not dogmatic and not ideologically singular, but nevertheless to come out with certain kinds of consciousness. So I don't know. That's you might disagree.
Let me try to disagree. And I actually don't disagree. I think I want other experts at the table, but I do think around the environmental challenges we face, as architects, we are poor communicators about the trade-offs around kind of carbon, energy, materials. And, we can speak eloquently, I think, about form in a convincing way, but we somehow do not yet have the tools or the language that I find many environmental engineers have. And I feel like we need to be as conversant in that language as we are in the humanities. And I think that can only just make our discipline stronger. But I do agree, we can't be experts in everything. And working collaboratively has, I feel like working collaboratively requires you to release some of the kind of authorship and control that you were taught at your desk in every review and every crit, which I think is still good training, but I feel like we're not yet creating the pedagogical models that train how to get to a great project that's uncompromising through collective, co-created, that is, of equal or actually better quality than a single individual could have done. But in practice, that's every day, right?
I want to really quickly return to Maria's point, which I thought was a really important one on the sort of how do we deal with the public, or how do you avoid the problem, the specter of fascism with the public, and a really sort of micro history of dealing with the public. So Habermas writes his Public Sphere in 1961. It doesn't get translated into English until 1989. And so the translation, it reached an American audience coinciding with its own critique, which also came around in 1989 with people like Nancy Fraser, Michael Warner, Michael Sandel. And so there was already, as we received that text and that notion of a public sphere coming around the idea of the development of the bourgeoisie and a critique of power through public encounters in cafes, newspapers, that came about with a critique that said, oh, it's not singular, it's not a single public sphere, but there are multiple public spheres. So people like Nancy Fraser did a very beautiful way of producing that. And I think right now we're encountering a sort of third phase of public sphere theory, and I think Tim Ingold's keynote actually captured that very well in saying, okay, we know the critique that we can't singularize the public. On the other hand, we can actually speak to certain shared issues in humanity that humanity faces, and shared measures for addressing those through issues of care, empathy, issues of need or want, recognitions of certain things that all humans should have, right? No one should be bombed by another country, right? I mean, there's certain, so I think that we're seeing a moment of understanding not a singularizing of the public, but a recognition of shared public needs. And I think that's where we can step in terms of understanding, not reducing people to a singularity, but understanding how they could be helped by certain needs.
That's fine. We'll open it up to the audience for questions.
Do you have a mic?
Hi, my name is Jin. Since we're talking about the public sphere, I have a strong interest in public art, and I know I applied for USC also because there was art department head of Susan Lacey who coined the term the socially engaged art, and the question will be we are talking about the public sphere in architecture, but I sometimes find that artists are doing much better jobs in making conversations and making collaborative works. And the reason that I came to Cornell is part of it because it has architecture and art and planning as a one department. But I find it a little difficult to working with art faculty members regarding the project or getting it as an advisor sometimes. So do you have any plans to like opening up the cross-disciplinary possibilities?
Is that for me?
I think that's aimed at you. Send that one your way.
I mean, I actually love this college because it has architecture, art, and planning, and I think I'm seeing our art chair and our architecture chair sitting next to each other over there, so maybe you guys could work out something. But, in Milton's talk, the issue around cities, right? I think this is, it's strange that in a college with such strength in architecture, art, and planning, that there aren't more opportunities and synergies between them. And I know our newest chairs are really excited to work together.
Very diplomatic.
Sorry. Thank you so much for the really stimulating, thought-provoking presentations. I wanted to ask a little bit more follow-up on the discussion about expertise and the humanities. Essentially, all of your talks dealt with the tensions in the early history of architecture and architectural education, having dropped out a lot of stuff. So I'm curious, given how complex building has become, in terms of the knowledge that's required, I wish to hear how you understand expertise and how you understand, let's say, humanities and critical discourse and politics in terms of pedagogy. Because to really, do you mean expertise as in, that architectural education has a professional, and then there should be a post-professional so that you can really develop, expertise in much more, I guess, advanced understanding, because you can barely get through the door to be able to talk about it in some areas. So, or is expertise really a thinking process? So it comes down to the question of how much should curriculum be opened up, to different sort of streams of expertise or elective or whatever, and how much should have a kind of core, conversation. Because in a way you could say that the more technology there is, the more need of understanding technology through the humanities needs to be more sophisticated. So the balance to me seems really tricky. And I'm curious what you think about it.
So since I brought up the topic, I feel like I'm on the hot seat to try to explain what I mean. I think that we think we have expertise around form. Who gave us that? So I think you're kind of right, Milton. There are these young people who decide to just go for something with limited expertise, and they pull it off. I'm scared of that world. I would like a world where people have true ability to have judgment and discern and care about publics and democracy and the environment, and really steward our built environment. And I guess my comment about expertise is just coming from my own realization that in practice, I am not yet equipped, even though I'm reading the books and, but I'm not yet equipped to discern and argue with my engineer. Whereas in the Collier Memorial, I could argue. Like somehow structure, we know enough to, thanks to Marc Cruvelier, he might have left, but I feel like, and so maybe expertise is not the right word. I'm not talking about we all need a doctoral degree in engineering subjects. But I would like to have as much command over materials and energy as I do over form and space and line, and organization. I feel like we have a great strength in that. And then kind of from a pedagogical perspective, I think discernment, like enough expertise to discern how to produce architecture and when to produce architecture.
I'll be really quick, actually. I think that was helpful. I prefer the term specificity, and this question of, I mean, I think a pedagogy should be one of teaching anyone to know how to ask the right questions, right? And to be specific about what they're doing. And so we cannot actually offer up expertise in the array of the Alice of architecture, right? But we can produce students who can know how to search for the right answers by approaching the right people to collaborate with, and know what questions to ask so that they can further the conversation, even if they can't produce the knowledge always themselves.
Thanks for the question. Well, yeah, my take would be that, we have to think about the preparation for practice. And are we saying that we need to take the entire burden of preparing someone to practice architecture in 5 years or in 3 years, and then the responsibility of the profession is zero? Or are we saying that we're training students to be able to do a lot of different things and to enter into the realm, the milieu of practice with skills that can then be adapted and shaped as they absorb the workflow that's in place there? I think the other thing would be, in thinking about that in that way, I think you could look at architecture school. I don't think any of our, I'm going to speak for, I don't think any of our faculties have the courage to do this, but really, and I don't think the NAAB has the courage to do it, but you could have a scaling model where, I don't know if in a BARC program, we have a BARC and MARC professional degree program like Cornell, I don't know if 10 semesters of design, if, I don't know, after 8 or 6, does someone get better? Do they get worse? I think there's a way of, scaling. If someone hits the threshold of a certain expertise in that design sequence in semester 6, why do another 4? Why can't they go and do some other electives and things like that? I think if we looked at every stream, every curricular stream, whether it be technology, design, et cetera, I think you could come up with a model which will allow students to equip themselves with certain threshold of expertise and then be able to dive into other areas and go deeper there. Again, I think we're moving so slowly. I mean, what I learned as dean is I don't really control anything. I can nudge people to do a lot of things. And so I just don't think we're equipped to make those kind of radical changes, and the NAAB is not equipped, and I don't even know if anybody agrees with me anyway. But that would be my take. I think we could look at structures which would unleash certain time, because time is really money, right? And to do that. I mean, we all have excellent post-professional programs that allow one to go deeper, 3 semesters, 4 semesters. Master Design, we have a Master of Advanced Architectural Research Studies and other degrees. So I think the pieces are there, but I think it's a matter of, the efficiency of them and kind of what are we training students for, going back to that question.
Jenny's hovering.
We could continue this discussion all evening, but we are nearing 8 p.m., and so I suggest that we continue the discussion outside. We have an incredible menu and reception planned, but before we do so, I want to thank all of our esteemed guests, Sarah, Jen, Milton, for an incredible series of presentations, and I would like to invite back Sachem Sam George to the stage for our closing. Sachem Sam George is one of 10 Sachems, chiefs, for the Cayuga Nation, representing the Bear Clan. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm Caroline O'Donnell. I'm chair of the Department of Architecture. I'll start with the land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Goyakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Goyakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Goyakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Goyakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So welcome, everyone. For those for whom this is the 4th time joining us for the last session, thank you, and I promise I'll keep this very short and sweet for you. But if it's your first time, welcome, and I will give a very lengthy introduction. It's our 150th birthday, and Breaking Grounds is this semester's Preston H. Thomas Symposium, funded through a gift to Cornell's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning from Ruth and Leonard B. Thomas of Auburn, New York, in memory of their son, Preston. Breaking Grounds is about the fundamental act of building, as in the first act of digging into the ground on a construction site, that very first moment. But we use the word breaking to also open up possibilities that we might break with some traditions at this pivotal moment in the discipline. In our first session, opened with The Words That Come Before All Else by Sachem Sam George, Amber Adams discussed the creation narrative of the Haudenosaunee people and the linguistic and cultural relationship between kinship and notions of the earth. Meredith Palmer talked about the land that was dispossessed in order for this institution to exist, and Sebastian Marot talked about the founding of the university in the site-specific context of the glacial landscape of Cayuga. Groundwork then began with the grounds on which our institution was built, quite literally, establishing a foundation upon which architecture's interconnectedness with land, water, and air are built. And this notion of interconnectedness and generation, as introduced in our keynote by Tim Ingold, really runs through all of these sessions and is fundamental to all of the conversations that we are having here today. Last week in session 2, Formwork, Laurie Brown reminded us that it matters who is at the table in order for change to happen. Nina Cook-John demonstrated how invisible bodies can be made visible, made larger than life, and made space for. And Arthur Wong, while impressed at how well we clean the robot after use, reminded us that using local waste materials is an old idea and one we need to revive for any shot at the future. These speakers and the topics about which they spoke joined us in order to spark ideas, not for long enough, but just briefly, to spark ideas in our own trajectories, to nudge us a little bit to think about what we're doing, to think about the interconnectedness in the small things we make and the big world that they're entangled in, to think about language and how things mean things, not just words, but also acts of architecture too, to think about relationships, the relationships we have and how important it is, who is at the table, who is in our reading lists, who is on our precedent lists, and what cultural references we're including and excluding with those choices. They nudged us to think about how we might begin to have difficult conversations that can actually be transformative in our lives and in the built environment, to think about a discipline whose practice is shifting from one dominated by a privileged client to one open to the possibility of action, activism, and community engagement. So if that set of speakers indicates where we're headed as a discipline, tonight in our last session, we turn our attention to the academy, that is you three. How do we prepare students for the future of architecture, for a career that will last from 2022 to 2072? How can what we teach today prepare the leaders of the future to address changes when we don't even know yet what that world will be? Luckily, it's in our DNA to imagine the future, to literally envision it, to draw it, to shape it, to try it out, to make that invisible vision visible to others. That is in our hands. So tonight's session, Schoolwork, looks at the education of the architect and asks how we might reimagine architectural pedagogy for that evolving world. Before allowing moderators Jenny Sabin and Maria Gonzalez-Pendes to introduce, I'd like to take 2 more minutes, the first of which I will spend talking about food. You'll remember in our first session, the menu was modeled after an old Cornell banquet from 1901. For tonight, we asked Serendipity to put together a menu of food that they thought we might eat in the future. So I'm glad to see tuna and salmon are doing so well here. They're still surviving in 2072, but otherwise we've got a lot of pickles, preserves, pastrami, sauerkraut powder, balsamic pearls, cured egg, and charcoal to look forward to. And the final minute I will take to say thank you especially to Wendelin Gonzalez. Wendelin, I think you should smile and stand up again because you've done all the work to make this possible. Also, Jolene Rickard, M. Constantine, Edith Fikes, Alix de Turquoise. Thanks also to Lily Chi, Sean Anderson, Marta Wisniewska, Jenny Sabin, Maria Gonzalez-Pendes, and John Zisovich, Joy Davis, Qingyao Wang, Jonathan Plass, Jack Lynch, Andre Hafner and his team, and all of our speakers, especially our speakers tonight. It is really incredible that you 3 are in the same room, and I'm so excited to hear what will happen in the future. Because you know, right? You have the crystal ball. So finally, we'll remember that we began a couple of weeks ago with the words that come before all else. It was a really, really moving 5 or 10 minutes. And Sachem George has kindly and generously suggested that he close our session again tonight. So we're delighted to have him back and look forward to that moment of reflection at the end of the evening. So thank you so much to our 3 deans tonight. I'm really looking forward to this session, and I will leave you in the good hands of Jenny and Maria to do introductions. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Seth Maria. I'm an assistant professor in architecture, and I'm excited to introduce this panel together with my colleague Jenny Sabin. Since I'm one of the historians in the room, I would like to get us started with a story that kind of repeats a lot of what Caroline just so beautifully presented. But I want you to picture a basement, an underground room, actually. In enter an anthropologist, a writer, and an architect, also a geographer, an artist, an engineer, a sachem, and a professor. They sit around a circle and begin to write up a manifesto with, let's say, 5 points on how to launch the Earth into a sustainable, just, and peaceful future. The order is rather tall, and for this order of business, they agree. First, the first point is to think of time and with time in more complex and nuanced ways that technoscientific one-directional narratives might suggest, while also embracing technological innovation. Point 2 is to think with and about the soil, the winds, the water, and the people in entirely new ways, while also comprehending the old modes of knowing of land and of political resistance that indigenous peoples, but also other communities, have been cultivated for hundreds of years. Point 3 is to think collectively and circularly in circles, to think with groups of experts and non-experts alike, to think with people of all paths of life and through circles of materials, of production of ideas, a collective circular thinking that should, however, also reassess each one's expertise. Point 4, they say, to think with and through intersections of gender, race, class, and climate inequity, to think of ways to decolonize bodies and minds, while also, however, keeping up the hopes and optimism alive and well. The excitement of the task builds up in the room, even as these contradictions are palpable in the room. And as the group reaches to a concluding point, they all turn to the professor, from whom they expect an intellectual and brainy climatic thought. They hope that the university will be the space for such a liberatory project to take shape. Instead, the professor throws her hands up in the air and asks, and how on earth am I actually meaning to teach all of this at the same time, all together in the same place? How do we relearn all of these, all the new ways of thinking and of being? And whom exactly and with whom am I supposed to teach all of this? So the pragmatism of the professor throws everybody off track, and I don't really know how the story ends. You can fill in the gaps. This is not a real story. This is my fictional musings of what's been going on in the last few days. Here in this room, the conversation was perhaps not as consensual and cohesive as what I just described, and certainly it was not in the form of a manifesto, a genre that's in and of itself already 100-year-old. Something different happened here, but this was the project, the program that was proposed to us. Even that question of how do we teach all of this together at the same time in the same space is probably not even one that you as students or faculty have asked, because we also know that teaching is collective. It's a collective effort. It's a division of labor. We don't all teach everything, we teach together. But there is one figure who does have to think about everything at the same time, happening in the same space and at the same time. And that's the figure of the Dean of the School of Architecture, or better yet, 3 deans of the Schools of Architecture, who we're all looking forward to listen to and help us discern ways to translate all of these orders that have been launched to us in this past few weeks, but also in this past couple of years, coming from all realms of life. How do we translate these tall orders and all challenges of architectural and political thinking into new pedagogies and into new futures? And I'm sure you're all going to do it in much more exciting and ambitious ways than our jaded professor in the story might have suggested. So our 3 speakers are not only fabulously positioned to do so because of their current roles in their institutions, but more importantly, I think, because of their own microhistories within the institutional boundaries of architecture, boundaries that they have been pushing against or redefining for quite some time. Before they became deans, they were pushing against architectural walls, institutional walls, in very generative and creative ways. Ways by which they look to expand the spaces, the modes of thinking, and the relations through which architectural and political thinking happens and takes place. And I'm excited to get us started. We're giving rather abbreviated introductions because you're all too laureated. We'll be here all afternoon. But I do invite everybody to look carefully at their biographies and, again, exploring the kind of institutional explorations that they've been doing for quite some time. First, we will hear from Milton Curry. He holds the Della and Harry McDonald Dean's Chair at the University of Southern California School of Architecture. In his previous position as the Dean for Academic Affairs and Strategic Initiative at the University of Michigan, Taubman College of Architecture and Planning. He was also Associate Professor of Architecture and an affiliated faculty in the Department of Romance Literatures and Languages, as well as Project Director of the Michigan Mellon Project on Egalitarianism, and the founder, director of the Michigan Architecture Prep Enrichment Program for high school students in Detroit. And I wanted to point this out again because of this institutional imagination. He was also for quite some time a professor of architecture here at Cornell. His design and scholarly work is a consistent interrogation of urbanism, modernity, and racialized thinking in his writings and lectures and in his creative work. He asks us to address race as part of the project of modernity, and I cannot stress enough how early and how critically he was putting these questions on the table, in part with the founding of journals such as Critical Productive Journal, but also Appendix Journal back in the day. We're very excited to have you open our panel today. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Dean Curry.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria, and for that great introduction, and also thank you to Caroline O'Donnell, your chair, Dean Meejin Yoon, and the entire planning team for the invitation to join such an inspiring set of colleagues today and throughout the 150th celebration of Cornell architecture. When I was a student here, I actually knew Ruth Thomas, and she was really a great person. Leonard was as well, but I knew Ruth better, and she supported the Cornell Journal of Architecture, amongst other things at the school. So it's an honor as well to be speaking in her honor. We were asked to frame our comments this evening on the future of our discipline and profession, the future of architectural education and pedagogy. And I would say about the future of architecture, if there is to be a future, it seems to me it has to be a recentering from form to program, and from program to critically informed empowerment, repair, and reinvention and performance. Empowerment of unheard voices, repair for the damage that the built environment has caused, reinvention and performance. Reinvention of a discipline and a practice too complicit with power, yet not demanding enough of power. And performance because most are now invested and interested in what buildings allow them to do. And the world in which we're situated is one that is globalized and interconnected, and one in which the demographic and geographic shifts that we're experiencing include moves toward urbanized locations for the world's population, migration and refugee movement away from autocracies and climate precarity, and the realization that the United States is becoming a majority non-white nation. Another observation is that we need to re-engage notions of the subaltern and rethink notions of modernity and modernism in order to undertake the critical project of repair and future-focused speculation and imagination. How do we answer the cultural moment that we're in, signal an optimistic future, and simultaneously educate a citizenry armed with the toolkit they need to remain relevant as what I will call, and have called, citizen architects, designers, and scholars? Now, I've divided my talk into 4 segments: egalitarianism in architecture thinking, democratizing culture in architecture thinking, rethinking the subaltern in architecture thinking, and finally, rethinking modernity and modernism in architectural thinking. I want to start by saying I think that one of the things we have an opportunity to do is to synthesize the global urbanization phenomenon with new thinking on what egalitarianism could actually look like in our world today and the future. The globalization ethos, one that encompassed peoples as well as commerce, is an ethos that also undergirds colonization and the ascension of empire. This is an old phenomena now appearing in new forms. But the implication can be boiled down to the same outcomes: marginalization of peoples of color, the dismissal of the poor, and the exploitation of labor in all of its forms. New empires have emerged as new forms of racism, ethnocentrism, and sexism have also emerged. Autocracies and democracies are in a continued struggle to marry these disparate forms of governance, empowerment, and disempowerment with new economies and the realities of a warming climate and increasingly scarce access to natural resources, water, and food. In our country and in our own time, fascism has reappeared, reimagined for an internet-based world, and has armed itself with the tried and true message of white supremacy and white nationalism. The movement towards cities and the assumed opportunities within the metropoles is also not new. The move from rural to urban has emblematized the move from poverty to wealth and from the primitivism to civilization, however stereotypically classist and colonialist these notions may be. According to predictions from the Global Cities Institute, by 2100, Lagos will reach a population of 88.3 million people. Kinshasa will reach 83.5 million, and Mumbai is projected to reach 67.2 million in population. So the city, as a unit of measure, is becoming enormously complex and complicated as we careen into the next century. And according to the UN Refugee Agency, over 84 million globally can be classified as refugees, displaced populations. In our own country, we've seen the devastating impacts of rural-based manufacturing and energy extraction hubs no longer of use, with these disruptions fueling political and social upheavals that result in policy fragmentation, even as the country attempts to deal with these conflicting forces. Egalitarianism, I would argue, remains a useful framework for examining the contemporary metropolis because it contains a theory of value based on the inherent equality of individuals and on some notion of a fair distribution of resources to individuals. Egalitarianism is thus a more ample construct through which to view the challenges and opportunities of today's modern metropolitan regions because it does not assume at its base a market-based or capitalist-driven imperative. Rather, egalitarianism can be used to ask, what if the underpinnings of resource distribution, transportation, housing allocation, industrial and waste management were in the service of the most equitable allocation of goods and services? Now, egalitarianism sounds great, but it's not an uncontested ideal and ranges from notions of equality of opportunity to equality of outcome and spawns other notions such as distributive justice and democratic equality. Far from universal, notions of egalitarianism and democracy encounter market economies, enslavement, colonialism, capitalism, and other societal forms of organization that complicate its most idealized goals. As focus has shifted from nations to cities, global cities, megacities, post-industrial cities, informal cities, new questions have emerged as to whether the metropolis is governable and whether the traditional forms of governance are inhibiting social progress on the part of individuals and polities. Even with renewed interest in urbanization and social justice, the role of egalitarian theory in practice has not yet been sufficiently engaged. Elizabeth Anderson, professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan, states, and I quote, "Cities are key sites where the increasingly diverse denizens of states learn how to relate to each other. Urban design helps determine whether they will relate to each other as equals or as dominant and subordinate." Let me go back. I think I made a mistake. Cities, and I quote, "are key sites where the increasingly diverse denizens of citizens learn how to relate to each other. Urban design helps determine whether they will relate to each other as equals or as dominant and subordinate, privileged and disadvantaged, honored and stigmatized, insiders and outcasts. From an egalitarian point of view, urban designers and architects need to be sensitive not only to the ways urban infrastructure distributes public goods across spaces occupied by residents of diverse identities, but also how urban design facilitates or blocks the circulation of people, ideas, cultural practices, and material goods across heterogeneous neighborhoods," end quote. Let me contrast that or complement that with a quote from Toni Morrison. She says, when our fears have all been serialized, our creativity censured, our ideas marketplaced, our rights sold, our intelligence sloganized, our strength downsized, our privacy auctioned, when the theatricality, the entertainment value, the marketing of life is complete, we will find ourselves living not in a nation, but in a consortium of industries, and wholly unintelligible to ourselves except for what we see through a screen darkly, end quote. As 80% of the world's population now live in cities, it's more important than ever to ask, what does democracy demand? What does justice demand of the global polity, its designers, and its humanists? Can the city organize us in such a way as to make us more prepared for social compacts that demand that we see the other as a fellow equal? A perspective egalitarianism in the hands of us, designers, should and can articulate the forensic role of architecture and urban design to analyze a problem visually, spatially, socially, to utilize the projective role of the discipline and the social capital of the discipline to theorize alongside humanists and others, and to provide speculative design options for collective consideration. Developing new critical methods from which to design cities by engaging with innovative conceptions of egalitarian thought, I believe can produce new forms of living and new spatial conditions from which we understand anew what it means to be human. Democratizing culture in architecture thinking. If we are to seize upon this phenomena of making our cities, making our world more egalitarian, I think democratizing culture is a piece of that toolkit. And if we're to seize upon this phenomena of a democratizing cultural milieu in order to build stronger communal bonds and flatten social hierarchies, then it's essential to understand the paradoxes inherent in this challenge. I agree with something that Professor Michael Hayes conjured many years ago, that the foundational assertion, his foundational assertion that architecture, quote, is central to the domains of cultural representation and is a signifying force in the processes of symbolic production, end quote. Architecture then can play a significant role in the emerging conversations on how culture is produced, what its meaning is, and whom it is produced for. Yet the democratization of culture is not a new phenomenon. Through Theodore Adorno and Max Horkheimer, we know that culture as separate from the market economy was a fading conceptualization even in the 20th century. And I quote Adorno and Horkheimer from The Culture Industry in 1944. Quote, culture is a paradoxical commodity. So completely is it subject to the law of exchange that it is no longer exchanged. It is so blindly consumed in use that it can no longer be used. Therefore, it amalgamates with advertising. The more meaningless the latter seems to be under a monopoly, the more omnipotent it becomes. The motives are markedly economic, end quote. And most of us would probably agree that expanding the reach of culture to a broad constituency of publics is a common good. It's a good idea. And that expanding rights and democratic participation in culture and politics is enriching to all of society. We would agree probably that this expansive cultural exposure has the promise of leveling the playing field and empowering all citizens towards a more egalitarian future. In many cities and counties, culture is reaching diverse constituencies. And the definition of culture has expanded beyond art museums and opera, to sports, entertainment, gaming, cultural rituals, and new kinds of communal gatherings. Cultural and academic institutions harbor biases and ideological blindnesses, yet they are our best hope for expanding public discourse with intellectual integrity and rigor. I count the academy as a cultural institution. Cultural institutions have transformed from elite spaces of consumption to diverse spaces of free exhibitions, convenings, performances, education, research, yoga, and many other things, appealing to audiences ranging from children to seniors, diverse ability communities, and others. The Shed in New York, the Cooper Hewitt, the Museum of Modern Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, these iconic, maybe Class A institutions now sit alongside a new constellation of community-grown, culturally rich, small and independent institutions that are merging art and public life. I'd like to talk about our LA institutions that I'm very proud of, such as Art and Practice, started by artist Mark Bradford and collector Eileen Norton. The Underground Museum, started by the late Noah Davis's wife, Karan Davis. And the Crenshaw Dairy Mart in Los Angeles, started by USC Roski Art and Design School alumni and co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors. But democratizing culture also requires us to be accountable for the wrongs shared by all of us and inflicted on only some of us. Nationally, we still reckon with the wounds of a violent occupation of native lands, so aptly conceptualized in this series of forums, violent enslavement and appropriation of Black diaspora labor, and a vast disenfranchisement of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples through systematic policy and legal frameworks that have rendered their freedom and access to all that the nation has to offer less than equal to their white and European immigrant counterparts. The nation's demographic turn from a majority white European immigrant nation to one that is majority people of color has and will continue to fuel racial resentment, backlashes against the ascension of people of color into the pantheons of economic, political, social, and intellectual power. These forms of backlash are exactly the opposite of democratizing culture in service of building a stronger social and cultural bond between strangers. They disavow accountability in favor of selfish notions of classed and raced imaginaries. Which brings us to really another piece of the toolkit I think that's important is to rediscover and re-engage subaltern studies, which I think has a lot to offer today. I ask, as Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak asked, and as Antonio Gramsci asked, quote, can the subaltern speak? And how is collectivity, as such, possible within our current world? One of the most important formulations in post-colonial work is in the area of subaltern studies, something that Antonio Gramsci began and was picked up on by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. And I want to set two things in motion here simultaneously. The first is that I believe that the subaltern has much more to give us as a conceptual schema as we attempt to truly understand otherness. That's one thing to put in motion. Secondly, that the taking away from our fellow citizens the ability to be visible, the ability to speak, is a core component of the current wave of autocratic and fascistic protocols that we now see happening quite explicitly in our own country. And I want to quote Toni Morrison here again from an essay. Quote, in 1995, Racism may wear a new dress, buy a new pair of boots, but neither it nor its succubus twin, fascism, is new or can make anything new. It can only reproduce the environment that supports its own health. Fear, denial, and an atmosphere in which its victims have lost the will to fight, end quote. And I want to complement that with Spivak herself, quote, "Women outside of the mode of production narrative mark the points of fade out in the writing of disciplinary history, even as they mind writing as such footprints of the trace of someone